Breathe with me once slowly, like you are learning to listen to a machine learning to breathe for the first time. Inhale, hold the quiet for a moment and let it go. Let the world around you soften. Imagine the galaxy as a great night, not a scattering of stars like glitter, but a careful arrangement of cold lamps and distant furnaces. Each is a small promise of light, patient and indifferent. Between those lamps lie the long, deep spaces where engines rest and the last transmissions peter out into static. That silence is where we begin. Picture a corridor of brushed metal and stone that has lived through 1,000 winters of ash. Feel the hush between the supports where dust has settled like sleep. There is a kind of loneliness in that hush, a loneliness older than empires, older than the speeches that once declared their glory. It tastes like iron when rain hits it and like the faint, mineral tang of ancient batteries. It hums in frequencies that people rarely bother to name. It is the note of machines remembering their purpose and then, perhaps, forgetting. This is the tone we will keep, gentle, even intimate at first. Let the cadence of my voice be a lamp you carry, guiding you deeper into a world that appears sensible, ordered, and clinically calm. Let it ease you, because the safest stories are the ones that begin as lullabies. We begin with rumor, with footnotes, with the small nothings that later gather teeth. They call them the flayed ones. Say the name softly, the syllables fall like drying cloth. At first it will mean nothing more than a piece of bad poetry scribbled in a ledger, a cautionary scribble on the margins of a maintenance manual. It will be the kind of name you half forget, like a dream you remember upon waking, and then slip away as your coffee cools. But there are names that hold pressure. The flayed ones is one of those names. It does not shout, it presses. Our point of view will be a single, narrow beam, a weary archivist of the cult mechanicus, a pilgrim in lenses and iron, a man who keeps his past like contraband. He is not heroic in the way epics require. He is the sort of person who loves lists and histories and the steady ritual of recording what needs preserving. He has been augmented where augments were demanded. His fingers have been replaced by delicate manipulators, and his eyes by lenses that can shade and focus like the iris of a camera. Yet inside him is a pocket of things that remain inexplicably human. A memory of a hand smoothing a blanket, the taste of bread in a world that now tastes of oil. He keeps those memories like small talismans, and he will need them. Imagine him crossing into an old vault the night it opens. The vault is set within a planet whose skies are often thick and low, a place where the rain carries the ash of distant forges. The air carries the damp chill of closed spaces and the scent of old oils. Doors the size of funerary gates part with that slow metallic groan that comes when metal is tired and remembers once being new. His lamp cuts the darkness like a measured breath. It is a soft, yellow light that brushes metal and bone as gently as one might turn the page of a well-loved book. The vault is not empty when he enters. It is full in the way a ship full of stored things is full: boxes, crates, racks of labeled components, each item pinned to its purpose like a moth to a cork board. The archivist moves through it the way someone moves through a garden, with precise gestures and gentle speech. He catalogs the small things with loving care, the way a priest might smooth the vestments of the dead. There is reverence in that motion. To preserve is to defer death a little longer. And yet, among the labeled reliquaries and mechanical hearts, there is something different. It is quiet in a way that is not simply the absence of sound. It is the silence of something that has been watched while it slept and has been stitched not to wake. He finds a mask first, propped upon a plinth the color of old teeth. The mask looks like a human face that has been stretched over bronze. Skin, pale and improbably preserved, is threaded with filaments and the smallest of seams. Where a tear might have been, there are neat metal sutures. Tiny conduits disappear into sockets around the temples, the sort of craftsmanship that implies both devotion and obsession. There is hair, too, woven into a lattice to anchor conductive filaments. The mask is beautiful in the way a dried flower is beautiful, delicate, flattened, the preservation of something that once moved. He lifts it with gloved hands the way someone lifts a relic. The interior is layered with notes, a ledger slipped into the hollow and sealed with wax, a strip of old data tape wrapped like a bandage. He feels the odd warmth within the mask, not blood warm, but a mechanical, residual heat that suggests circuitry and ritual combined. He reads the ledger by the light of his lamp. His handwriting is precise where cataloging requires it to be, and where the ledger hesitates, the script changes. A hand less steady, perhaps hurried, perhaps afraid. That quiver is the first thing he will file, not under procedures, but under the quietly dangerous name of curiosity. Listen with me now to the world in that vault. The faint hiss of air passing through a vent, the distant echo of water running into riverbeds somewhere beyond the planet's crust, the last notes of a vox channel that plays, for reasons no one can divine, a lullaby in a language older than the archivist's faith. There is a servitor in the corner, a stitched-together automaton whose arms are too long for its body, and its glass eye tracks the archivist with a slow, mechanical interest. You might imagine these are all ordinary things. They are not entirely. They are the small mechanics that let dread creep without clamor. What makes the Flayed ones more than a grisly phrase scraped into the margins is the way they blur line and law. They are not simply corpse nor simply machine. They are an anatomy of compromise, preserved skin and living wire, a corpse's quiet with an automaton's will. They belong to the region of thought where faith to the machine god and necrotechnologies might meet and do business in silence. To those who study their traces, they are both abomination and object lesson, a demonstration of control and of the cost of that control. The archivist knows the language of tools. He knows liturgical injunctions about what to preserve and what to bury. He reads the strip of data tape. At first it is ordinary measurements, inventory lists, a log of maintenance. Then there are rhythms that repeat not like a chorus but like a heartbeat. 3 clicks, pause, 2 clicks, something counted, cataloged, repeated. Overlaid upon those counts is a thin voice layered into the recording, the kind you hear in confessionals. Hushed, insistent, the cadence of recitation. It is a voice that may be prayer or command. Sometimes those words look the same in a tongue devoted to functioning. As the tape spins, the room seems to compress. The atmosphere thickens. The archivist feels a small, animal unease, like the moment you sense someone watching when no one stands in the doorway. He tells himself the tape is a curiosity and thus must be cataloged. He tells himself the act of recording is its own defense against being overwhelmed. He is correct, in a small, practical way. To name is to keep distance. But there are names that function like hooks. The Flayed ones is one such name. He notes small details with the scientist's calm that masks a private ache. The sutures are not merely mechanical. Some are woven with hairs from different scalps. The stitching patterns mimic liturgical sigils that are older than the planet the vault sits upon. There are traces of chemicals whose formulation suggests both preservation and an attempt to coax muscle into function. There are notes on the margins written in an urgent hand, ritual sequences that read almost like repair protocols. They are not always distinguishable. There are diagrams that look equally like anatomical charts and schematics for power transfer. When the archivist traces a finger along one diagram, the pattern beneath the ink seems to shift, as if the line has been patiently encoding a memory. Throughout his life, the archivist has watched bodies become instruments. He has seen men rejoice in the medicine of their new limbs, and he has watched the slow pallor creep over them as they traded warmth for efficiency. He has loved things in the human way, a poem, a memory, a song. Those loves make him tender when he bears witness to the Flayed ones. He thinks, for a brittle moment, that someone must have believed they were saving something, a life, a mind, a memory. But belief can be a cruel tool. The methods that preserve can also convert, and the line between saving and taking grows thinner with every adaptation. There are other markers in the vault. Tiny bones in jars labeled with dates that have no meaning to civil calendars, icons that have been reworked from once holy emblems into the teeth of machines, and artifacts that smell faintly of burnt offerings. The archivist catalogs these with the same steady care he gives the mask, and for each one there is a small tightening in his chest, the sense of an arithmetic of sacrifice. He knows that to make something eternal one must sometimes remove what makes it living. The ledger is careful to note the trade-offs. How much of a person was permitted to remain, what functions were prioritized, which parts were declared expendable, and always in the margins the whisper. It comes as a pattern, not a phrase. Static that seems to form words if you tilt your head a certain way, a rhythm that could be instruction or memory. The archivist hums to himself to fill the silence. He hums the old hymns taught in the shrines of his youth, and the tune sits oddly against the text on the tapes. There is a dissonance there that he cannot place, as if two rituals are overlaying each other like two images misaligned. The image of worship and the image of calculation. The atmosphere of the vault, the archivist notes, is melancholic. Even the machines seem to keep their voices low as if not to wake something. The world outside the vault is no bright, beating place of parades and proclamation. It is a series of worn steps, of maintenance schedules and quiet sacrifices. Empires here do not announce themselves with fireworks. They persist because someone remembers to oil the hinges. The melancholia is not merely sadness. It is a functional feeling, a recognition that the galaxy is a place where something is always being given up. As he continues to catalog, he thinks of the people who once lived under the skins now stretched like banners. He imagines small gestures retained, a thumb scratch at a sleepy brow, a whispered nonsense rhyme to a child. He imagines those gestures fading like old paint under solvent, visible only where the solvent did not fully reach. He keeps such images in his mind not to commemorate but to anchor himself. They are evidence that, once, these bodies were not instruments. There is a slow procedural rhythm in the way he works. He documents the mask, then the tape, then a line of small, hand-stitched gloves meant to protect the palms of a creature whose hands have been modified into tools. He makes notes of discrepancies, and each discrepancy drips into a pool of concern that grows not with hysteria, but with a practical sort of dread. This is important, a rational dread that focuses the mind rather than scatters it. Toward the end of the night, the archivist pauses by a sealed alcove. He has been told by the older priests that some doors are not to be opened. Ritual cautions, practical hazards. He has always listened to such admonitions because caution is a kind of piety in his line of work. Tonight, the seal is not broken, but it creaks as if something inside has shifted. The archivist stands very still. He listens. There is a sound like fabric being folded, so small and domestic that it seems impossible in a place built of steel and bone. Allow your breath to slow now with his. Let the lull of cataloging become a cloak. He is careful. He has done nothing rash. He has found relics and recorded them. He will rebundle them and place them back under seals that mean something only to his order. He will file his notes and go to sleep in quarters whose windows show nothing but the steady glow of the nearby refineries. Yet before he does those things, he takes a single, measured breath and slides his hand beneath the lid of the alcove. Within, folded like a ceremonial shroud, he finds something that does not belong to a ledger. It is soft, and when he lifts it, the fabric clings to his fingers like memory. There is a faint warmth there, again not living warmth, but preserved heat the way an engine retains residual warmth long after the ignition. It will be in all future pages, he writes, the moment the catalog becomes a confession. We will not rush beyond this for now. Let the image rest, the archivist, his lamp, the mask, the tape, the whispered rhythms. Let the world press close like a hand that both comforts and restrains. We are safe in this room of recording and remembrance for a little while, but keep the feeling of the fabric on your fingers. That small sensation will be the thread that leads us deeper later. For now, breathe. Let the hum of the vault become the sound under your ribs. In the quiet, the data tape clicks once, twice, then continues. The ledger flutters in the slight gust of air that rises from the alcove. Outside, the rain begins its patient answer, and somewhere, even now, something stirs beneath a line sewn with the same careful hand that ties the ledger shut. They are not yet awake, they are only being prepared. Move with me again quietly. Let the motion be small, a turning of a page, a soft adjustment of the lamp. Keep the cadence slow. The voice we use here is careful because the subjects we touch are thin-skinned in the ways that matter. This chapter lives in the laboratory of rumor and the chapel of hypothesis. It is where scholars, priests, and madmen meet over a map and argue until sunrise about what was done and why. There are no neat answers. There are only traces and patterns that accept interpretation like a wound accepts salt. We begin with the oldest thing that shadows often hide behind: a name. Names are the closest things we have to maps. They point. The flayed ones, the phrase suggests method, stripping, exposing, revealing. Yet the method is slipperier than the name implies. Flaying, in the everyday sense, is violence done to skin. In the context we will explore, flaying becomes an operation of translation. Skin as membrane, skin as conductor, skin as interface. The bodies beneath the skins are both repositories and instruments. They become both archive and antenna. There are three broad families of origin stories scholars argue over at candlelit symposia and in whispered exchanges in maintenance halls. Each has its own logic, and each leaves something out. Some claim the flayed ones are the experiment and the experimenters both, an outgrowth of necrotechnology, where the boundaries between life and machine were intentionally blurred. In this reading, the flayed ones are the product of a civilization or cult seeking to preserve memory in living tissue. Flesh, it was thought, holds a kind of record-keeping that metal does not. The scars of experience, the minute biochemical traces of taste and tear, the way a thumb remembers the curve of a favored cup. To that end, necrotech artisans sought to graft machine into skin not to replace the human, but to preserve it, to make memory permanent and portable. The horror from this vantage arises where preservation becomes possession. Machinery becomes an agent of rewriting memory. Flesh resists. The two quarrel, and the result is something grotesquely intimate. Another branch of lore points to Necron intersect, not as straightforward authorship but as an interference. The Necrons, ancient and alien, have their own priorities: archiving and stasis, dominion and rulership by cold decree. Where they touch, things are reordered into geometries of endurance. Scholars who favor this idea suggest a contact, deliberate or accidental, where Necron necroarchitectures fused with local practices of preservation. The outcome is a hybrid, mechanisms that strive for static perfection paired to flesh that stubbornly resists being frozen. The effect may be features in the flayed ones: the unnatural stillness, the preserved skin with luminous veins, the runes that look like star maps. But it leaves the question open whether the Necrons intended such a union, or whether their technologies were co-opted and misread by mortal hands. The third set of theories points to corruption. Here, the rituals that bind flesh to machine were not cleanly technological but religiously contaminated. The rites invoked powers that should not be named, forces that feed on sacrifice of identity rather than bodies alone. In this reading, the flayed ones are the result of those rites going wrong. A devotion to a machine god that became a mania toward annihilating the self. Or more insidiously, an invocation that invited something else entirely. Chaos does not always shout. It often works like a slow leak, changing definitions until the terms preservation and domination are indistinguishable. Each hypothesis holds a shard of truth. Each leaves a cut. What binds them is not proof but pattern. The flayed ones always sit at the intersection of preservation and erasure. Whatever made them meant to keep something. Whatever the method, the cost was paradoxically in what was kept. There is a pragmatic side to the Flayed one's nature that archivists and engineers can trace in the tools and marks they leave behind. These are not merely corpses with prosthetics. The bodies are the prosthetics. The operations performed are meticulous and repetitive. They read like maintenance logs as much as they read like liturgy. We will describe these steps as a way to understand what was intended and what was lost. Individuals chosen for conversion were often selected according to criteria that are at once practical and grotesquely ceremonial. Often they were those whose memories mattered. Veterans with pattern-rich histories, priests who had chanted the same rites for decades, record keepers whose minds held the grammar of language and law. In other instances, the selection was darker and swept from plague wards, orphan brigades, or prisoner holds. Bodies were prepared like artifacts, cleansed, bathed in solvents, drained of fluids that could later interfere with necrobinds. The skin was treated with stabilizers, compounds that prevented decay, but also made the tissue receptive to electrical conduction. This treatment is careful to maintain the skin's pliancy. It must be able to move and flex, to still carry the subtle memory markers that living muscle retains. The central, defining operation is the weaving. Filaments, nanoconductors, and microactuators woven into the dermal layers. Think of a circuit board embroidered into living skin. These filaments do several jobs simultaneously. They stabilize the cellular structure, carry electrical signals, and give pattern to tactile memory. Weaving is an artisanal act, a combination of surgical precision and ritual knotwork. Suture patterns are not only functional but symbolic. The makers often inscribe sigils into the weave, both for mechanical reasons, to guide signal pathways, and as a kind of prayer to keep the memory intact. Machines required grip, so small anchors are implanted into bone, into joint sockets, into skull sutures. Some are simple, metallic tabs that carry power. Others are complex, with interface chips that negotiate between synaptic patterns and digital protocols. These anchors are often placed where bones are thickest, and they are crafted with care to minimize rejection. Yet rejection is not always biological. Sometimes it is psychic. Memories cling to bone as stubbornly as to skin. Anchors, therefore, are also negotiation points between stubborn human recall and algorithmic storage. Once the weave and anchors are in place, the body is sometimes covered or encapsulated in layers of ceremonial fabric and metalwork. These coverings function to stabilize temperature and to carry sensorial inputs into controlled pathways. Rituals accompany the operation. Incantations, recitations of logs, or the playing of old tapes and songs. The interplay of technical and ritual is essential. It calms neural patterns, aligns input-output cycles, and, some practitioners believed, offers the awakened machine a moral compass. Whether or not such rites had any metaphysical efficacy, they did affect the human operators. Ritual binding made consent or justification easier. Activation is gradual. At first there is a warm, residual hum. The weave accepts signals irregularly, as if remembering how to walk. Tuning involves calibrating feedback loops. Too much machine control will crush any residue of spontaneous thought. Too little leaves the creature in painful limbo, half dependent and half denied. Practitioners sought a sweet spot where memory could be read, without losing the living contours of identity. The irony and horror is that, in the search for fidelity, the sweet spot often slid closer to annihilation. The more faithful the read, the more the machine could overwrite and precise the human into a static archive. This is the anatomy of method. We must stress boundaries here. Some flayed ones appear to have been constructed with patient, near-loving care. Others show ragged, hurried operations that suggest crisis or warfare. The commonality is that in each body, the self was restructured to be both receiver and record. Flesh becomes interface. Identity becomes data. If the body is the instrument, memory is the coin. The flayed ones are, in many ways, ledger keepers, living ledgers with memories stitched into their surfaces. This is where the tragedy sings loudest. Human memory is not merely data. It is sensation, error, bias, and habit. It is a braided thing. Smell tied to a street, a laugh to a childhood friend, a scar that remembers a fall. Machines read data in ordered ways. They are precise and unforgiving. The act of making flesh readable involves translating braided, messy human recall into tidy, indexable forms. This act of translation is where loss occurs. When memories are indexed, they are compressed, nuances trimmed, associative leaps pruned. The result is clarity at the cost of richness. Where once a memory might have been a warm, messy strand, it becomes a labeled file with timestamps. The people who become flayed ones may retain a factual skeleton of their lives, names, places, dates, but lose the soft, associative connections that made their stories humane. The archivist will be able to read Battle of Harn, 14th Cycle, but not the private superstition the soldier held that saved him from a panic in the mud. The maintenance of preserved memory often requires repetition. Tapes played, recitations recorded, stimuli simulated. That repetition grinds sensation into habit. What once was a favorite song becomes a looped file. Exposure without novelty dulls effect. People inside these constructs can become catalogers of themselves, endlessly recollecting the same event until even the recollection becomes a hollow ritual. The personality calcifies around its most played tracks. Machines optimize. To make room for overlaid data, previous records are often suppressed. This overwrite might have been an accidental consequence of early systems, or a deliberate attempt to prioritize crucial memories. Either way, the person who stands in the shell after such overwrites is not the same person who went in. Their identity is a patchwork. Being maintained as an archive objectifies the subject. Instead of being a person with rights and agency, the flayed one often becomes property, to be consulted, disassembled, queried. This external gaze produces psychological estrangement even before mechanization eats the self. The knowledge that one exists for the consumption of others, that the self has become a resource, corrodes the internal sense of worth. The result of these mechanisms is a kind of double loss, physical transformation and internal erosion. The components replace, the memory compresses, and the human thread thins. It is not always violent in the cartoon sense. Sometimes it is a slow, bureaucratic attrition that leaves souls worn like old cloth. Ritual and procedure are two faces of the same coin in the making of the flayed ones. The operators often could not tell where faith ended and engineering began. This confusion is important. Ritual is not mere superstition in these contexts. It is a technology of consent and alignment. Reciting a vow or hymn during integration served as psychosocial calibration. It got the human operators and the human subjects onto a shared script, smoothing the cognitive dissonance that would otherwise produce backlash, neural, social, or bureaucratic. Ceremony transformed medical deviance into sacrament. A blade used in a procedure is less grotesque when an entire liturgy accompanies it. Ritual provided ethical cover and social legitimacy. In some late diagrams, we find gestures encoded into the signal pathways, hand movements, hymns, specific breathing patterns used to trigger or stabilize certain neural maps. The ritual became code. When ritual fails, whether because of haste, contamination, or design, the consequences are raw and messy. A misplayed chant, a skipped offering, an incomplete burn. Any of these can unbalance calibration and produce beings that stagger between states. A crucial, chilling question. Once made, who controls them? The answer is messy. Empires, militaries, and religious orders often viewed flayed ones as resources, troves of memory and expertise. They were consulted in tribunals, used as living archives for battle strategy, or displayed in halls as proof of triumph over mortality. This instrumental use often compounded their objectification. Some flayed ones seem to exhibit slow, limited volition. Their bodies can adjust posture, They can respond to direct queries, and they sometimes hum or repeat phrases not in their recorded files. Such acts suggest remnant agency, not full personhood but an echo of choice. There are rare reports, contested, fragmentary, where clusters of flayed ones exhibit coordinated behavior, as if a distributed mind emerges from the network of preserved memories and shared inputs. These reports are dangerous to consider because they border on attributing consciousness to systems that were not meant to be conscious. Yet they persist because witnesses swear to the pattern, a chorus of remembered voices aligning into a single, eerie purpose. In many records, we find explicit control nodes, command sigils in the weave, tokens that authorize access, sequences that trigger compliance. This suggests at least some degree of central control vested in the makers or their successors. But control requires maintenance. Facilities fall into decay, custodians die or go away. Over time, control fractally loosens, leaving a patchwork governance of the living archives. One thread cannot be ignored: the unmistakable echoes of preternatural design, runes that match star maps, patterns that look like Necron sigils, artifacts whose metallurgy is energetically resonant in ways fair men cannot replicate. Yet the presence of Necron-like signs does not equate to Necron authorship. Two possibilities dominate the debate. Necron technology, or artifacts, were encountered and reverse-engineered. Mortal engineers, dazzled or desperate, tried to graft these alien methods onto their own rituals. The result would be hybrid tech that carries alien fingerprints, not a deliberate Necron project, but the inevitable contamination of any contact with artifacts beyond understanding. A darker suggestion posits that the Necrons, in the cold centuries of their wanderings, sometimes preserved data in ways that inspired mortals. They are not benevolent tutors. If they influenced mortal designs, it was likely incidental or part of their inscrutable aims. The Necrons might find value in life preserved as a static archive, or they might have used biological hosts as tests for particular energies. Both views point to the same philosophical point: where alien and human arts mingle, consequences ripple in directions no technician anticipated. A borrowed method is never a fully owned method. Chaos need not be named to be present. It seeps in as misalignment, as the wrong chord struck in a hymn, as an ink blot in a ledger. When rites misfire, when maintenance logs are corrupted, when care is replaced by expedience, the door cracks. Into that crack other things, desires, hunger, voices, can blow. In several recovered ceremonies, we find sigils that were once prayers now flayed into teeth and blades. The same pattern that was meant to bind memory can be read as a summons. Symbolic language is porous. Chaos often flips values. What was once an act of devotion becomes a ritual of consumption. The intent to preserve can invert into the intent to harvest. The flayed ones in this frame become a buffet for something that feasts on identity. Records suggest that once rituals became contaminated, the preserved memories themselves began to change. They no longer reflected a life lived but a narrative shaped by other minds. Victims' recollections warped into codes that favored directives and obedience. Personality traits folded into algorithmic priorities. The person within the shell became a message designed to invite more of the same. We do not possess a single, definitive account of the first creations. Instead, we gather fragments, the whispered notes of an engineer who went mad and left his tools untended, the ledger of a cult that insisted their work was saving souls, the charred bones of a facility where priest and technician died in equal numbers. Each artifact is a small, blunt instrument of testimony, a child's lullaby looped into a command, found on a tape. What was once comfort now triggers movement. A soldier's private superstition, now a security protocol. A charm sewn into armor becomes access token for a latch. A set of hands that still set a bowl on a table. A preserved reflex retained in a flayed one. Small human acts subsumed into ritualized function. These artifacts show both cruelty and tenderness. that the makers often tried to preserve what they loved, and in preserving, they sometimes destroyed the loved thing. So what finally are the flayed ones? They are a border phenomenon, an experiment at the edge of definitions, a way station between memory and object. They tell us about human methods and human hubris as much as they tell us about alien contamination or occult interference. Their existence forces questions we can barely hold. What value do we place on memory versus being, on utility versus warmth, on archive versus life? And through the lens of humanity lost, we feel the true ache. These were people who once laughed, prayed, cried, and broke things. We can measure their pasts in log entries, but we cannot fully weigh the warmth of a laugh or the precise timbre of a mother's voice the way their skin once did. They exist now as repositories for truths that are no longer their own and as warnings that the pursuit of permanence can become the cultivation of erasure. As the lights dim in our study, imagine a single flayed one in a glass room, skin threaded with filaments, eyes that track without surprise, a faint hum like an old lullaby drifting from its chest. It responds when its name is called, not because it remembers the call as a child would, but because a machine inside recognizes the sequence. It is both present and absent, a contradiction in motion. We will carry this image forward. The next chapters will pry at the small, sharp seams. The early horror buildup, the ways bodies fail and machines overreach, the chorus of whispers that gather into intent. Keep with me. Keep your breathing slow. We are in a library of ghosts and mechanisms, and the books we stroke with our fingertips sometimes rub their spines on teeth. There is no conclusion here, only more rooms to open, more tapes to play. The nature of what we have described resists endings. It wants to be read into perpetuity. And as we turn the page toward the early horror, listen for the telltale sound. That small rubbing like skin on wire that grows louder when the lights go out. We move once more with small, careful motions. Keep your breathing slow. Let the rhythm of the prose be a steady mechanical metronome. Long, patient bars at first, then a slight acceleration as your attention follows the pilgrim deeper into the vaults. This chapter is the accumulation of small things, the way a single hairline crack in a lens can become a cataract of meaning, the way a repeated misfire collects in the margins until it becomes pattern. We will linger on those small things until they accumulate weight enough to tip the world. The archivist, our pilgrim, settles into a routine. He catalogs at dawnless hours, catalogs until the lamps dim, and keeps notes in a ledger whose pages are soft from being turned. His hands move with the calm exactitude of someone who has learned to measure his life in labels. For several days after the discovery of the mask and tape, his work is methodical. He records the mask's weave number, the filigree pattern of its sutures, the precise alloy used for the bone anchors. He plays the tape repeatedly in careful cycles, noting frequencies, overlaid voices, and the points of static. Routine is a salve. Repetition is protection. In the beginning, repetition stabilizes what might otherwise dislodge him. It begins as the smallest of deviations. On the third playing of the tape, the archivist notices that a phrase repeats not by the tape's pattern but by the room itself. Somewhere beyond the vault, in ducts and cold piping, a pattern echoes the rhythm. Click, pause, click, click, pause. It is not the tape echoing. The tape plays a different pattern at that moment. The pattern in the vents is older, a structural rhythm that maps onto the tape almost like a translation. He writes coincidence in his ledger because that is the nature of his work, to name and then to test. He plays the tape again. The pattern returns. He positions small magneto indicators along the vent line and watches their tiny needles tremble in time with the clicks. He notes the alignment, and then he pauses for the first time in days to feel something that is not strictly a technical observation. A small, private discomfort, like the beginning of a bruise. He has cataloged improbable artifacts before and explained them away. He is trained to do so. But there is an oddity in his training now, an emotional memory that responds to pattern the same way flesh responds to touch. At night, something else happens. His augment, a fine ocular lens that can slice visual fields into layers, begins to fail in the margins. He sees a faint fringe at the edge of his vision, a filament of light that does not respond to any known wavelength. It flickers when he looks directly at it and steadies when he looks away. He blinks and the fringe dissolves. The lens reports no error. He logs the anomaly with a calm hand and then does what all careful custodians do. He runs the diagnostic. The diagnostic returns with no fault. The flicker is not a mechanical failure, the diagnostic claims. It is, perhaps, a reading that exists only for an observer who is paying attention. At first, this is an extra detail he notes and files. But anomalies multiply with the parable-like patience of seeds. The servitor, the stitched-together automaton in the vault's corner, begins to hum an idle tune at intervals that match the tape's overlay. The servitor's servos, normally torpid without instruction, twitch in syncopation with the tune, as if remembering choreography from a long-ago children's dance. Once, when the archivist passes with his lamp, the servitor turns its head the way a pet once turned toward a familiar voice. It has no name, but in the ancient habit of the human heart, the archivist hears it as recognition, and the sound is unexpectedly intimate. The pilgrim is careful not to anthropomorphize, and he repeats his mantra: observe, record, do not presume. He writes the event down with neat ink. He replays the tape, slowing it 2 cycles down and amplifying low-frequency rumble. In the undercurrent, below the words that can be parsed, there is a subvocalization. It is not language in the usual way. It is a clustered pattern of pitch and pause that sings like a throat clearing itself of old habits. The archivist feels it in his jaw, in the small hairs at the base of his neck. He notes, subaudible pattern present, resonance at 1316 Hz, associated with vent clicks, possible structural cross-interference. That phrase, structural cross-interference, will be copied and shared by other scholars in later years as though it explains the thing entirely. It does not. Explanations will always be tidy. Phenomena rarely are. The skin in the mask seems to respond as well. When he lifts the mask to study it in those long, steady hours, a faint warmth throbs under the preserved dermis. Not heat in the sense of blood warmth, but the residual kinetics of a complex network, a set of filaments responding to input. Once, when his gloved hand brushes the mask's cheek, the surface twitches like a muscle that remembers a laugh. He withdraws his hand reflexively, and the gesture leaves him with a domestic kind of guilt. He had touched someone's face. That someone's face, even now, still bears millimeters of memory. He plays the tape again and again. The archive begins to feel less like object and more like presence. The voices captured in static become clearer in ways that alter his sleep. Names emerge in the hiss, small, private names that snag him like a memory. A child's nickname, a smell attached to a market stall. The detail is so specific and personal that it insists on proximity. These were not random bodies. They were people with private textures. Dreams follow the long hours of listening. In the dream, the archivist walks through a city that is mostly scaffolding and silence. There are children's toys half buried in dust, the creak of shutters, and at the center a plaza where masks like the one he found hang from poles. They swing together and sing, not in words but in the modulation of breath patterns, as if a choir made of exhalations. He wakes with the phantom smell of a spice market on his skin, and his augment records a microsurge that corsets his sleep cycle. He notes it mechanically in the ledger, then rubs his face with the back of his hand as if to rub the dream away. The timing of these disruptions is not random. Each small anomaly occurs in the wake of particular ritualistic artifacts the archivist notices. A fold of fabric stitched with a sigil, a small bone charm etched with a child's name, a strip of tape that has been played to the point of wear. It is as if the artifacts themselves hum with retained ceremony, and the humming is contagious. The pilgrim begins to notice a pattern. The artifacts that are most intimate, the lullaby tape, the child's charm, are the ones that most frequently coincide with the servitor's twitching and the vent clicks. The implication is subtle and terrible. Something about the personal is acting as a key to an older machine. He begins experiments that are both clinical and sacramental. He isolates the tape and plays it in a soundproof chamber. He runs it through a dozen filters and records the harmonic overtones. He places the Flayed mask into a sealed container and pumps out the air, then flushes it repeatedly and replaces it with inert gases. Some patterns persist. The servitor's twitch remains. The vent clicks continue. Him noting the continuity feels like stepping into a loop. In the language of his ledger, the phenomenon begins to gain its own slim vocabulary. Lingering mnemonic resonance, index-triggered systemic response. The pilgrim's colleagues, older priests and fellow archivists, offer pragmatic suggestions. It is cross-coupling, one says. A resonance from the ducts and a stray harmonic on old magnetic tape. Another suggests that the mask is picking up ambient data and converting it into minute thermal shifts that animate the weave. They are right in small ways and wrong in the ways that matter. Technical answers will always be part of the story, but not the whole of it. The pilgrim listens to them with the patient calm of someone who has been trained to trust multiple frameworks at once. He is aware of the way superstition creeps in when mechanisms are not fully understood. He humors their theories, but he also keeps the ledger open, notes at the margins where rational explanations fray. The pilgrim's body, meanwhile, starts to fail in ways that are inconveniently human. A joint in a replacement finger begins to seize at odd intervals. The lubricant he uses bears a chemical signature he does not recognize. He experiences a moment of mesynchrony when the manipulator arm on his prosthetic will not align with his neural instruction for a full, unnerving second. In the second in which his finger does not obey, he is aware of a small gap where a thought should be, a blank like a missing word. He lurches, and his chest tightens in the private, animal way of someone who has nearly fallen. He starts to wonder if the very act of listening to those archives has altered the architecture of his augment. He checks his augment's logs and finds short, puzzling entries. Input acknowledged, no trust token present, non-authorized pattern encountered, index mismatch. The logs are cryptic. He asks a colleague to help decode them, but by then the more practical problem looms. When the manipulator misfires, it is not just a technical problem. His hand, which was once a reliable instrument of wood and ink, no longer feels like an extension of himself in the quiet intimacy he prized. He reacts with small, private panic, a tightness at the base of the skull. He begins to map connections between his discomfort and the vault's patterns. There is a night, particularly, when the tape plays a phrase that sounds like a child calling an elder's name. The servitor twitches. The vent clicks to the same cadence. The archivist's augment misfires, and, for the first time, he feels a memory that is not his own slide into him as if through a keyhole. The taste of metal in the mouth of a child, the smell of mother's oil, the pressure of a small hand in his palm. He recoils, gropes for control, and the sensation lingers like a bruise. He has not slept properly for days. He writes more ink than usual and underlines margins. There is a tremor in his pen now. At this point, the narrative of coincidence begins to weaken under the weight of recurrence. The pilgrim is no longer content to only catalog. He suspects another pattern beneath the pattern. Ritual. The very artifacts that show intimacy, a lullaby loop, a child's charm, a practice stitch, occur in a particular spatial arrangement in the vault. The mask sits on its plinth. Around it are small objects arranged in a quasi-ceremonial ring. The archivist notes the geometry, a circle with objects equidistant and pointed toward the mask as if in offering. He measures angles. He writes down times. He spends hours with a compass and a lamp, mapping geometry in the ledger, as if geodesics could reveal intent. His suspicion grows into conjecture. Perhaps the original makers constructed a lattice of intimate objects as keys, tokens embedded with mimetic signatures designed to anchor specific circuits. Each object is a unique waveform, a particular pattern of tiny smells and textures and sonic residues that the weave recognizes. Placed in a pattern, these keys form a lock. When the lock aligns, when vent clicks sync, when tapes play, when servitors twitch, something on the other side reaches and responds. The notion is slowly horrifying. If true, it implies purpose. The flayed ones are not accidental hybrids, but instruments in a ritual that translates life into protocol. The ritual is not merely superstition. It is engineering infused with the logic of worship. The distinction is slippery. To make someone an instrument with love, or to make them an instrument with ritual, is to surrender them nonetheless. He tests the hypothesis by removing one token from the ring. He replaces the lullaby tape with a blank strip and watches. The servitor still twitches, but with less regularity. The vent clicks mutate. The effect is not binary. It is not that removing the tape breaks the song. It is that the pattern degrades. The lock needs all its teeth to sing perfectly. This, more than any single anomaly, cements his suspicion. It suggests that the system was designed with redundancy, with ritualic reinforcement built in like backup circuits. As the pilgrim continues his experiments, his inner life frays in small ways. Memory leaks occur, but not wholesale. They happen like punctuation errors, a word remembered incorrectly, a name that shifts genders, a recipe that replaces sugar and salt in his mind for a moment. He blames fatigue. Others blame tiny electromagnetic interference. He grows more secretive about his dreams, which now come often and in small, vivid shards. In the dreams, he hears voices in static that call him by his given name in a voice that is not his own. He wakes with a taste of someone else's grief on his tongue, and finds that his hymn songs have begun to include a phrase he hears in the tape, a half-chant borrowed and folded into his own liturgy. One night, when the rain outside the vault is a continuous, dull drum, the mask hums for real. Not the phantom warmth, not the responsive twitch, but a low, tonal vibration that resonates in the bones of the room. The archivist, who has become so intimate with the artifacts that he can no longer tell whether his body's reactions are his own or induced, feels it in his teeth. He places a hand on the mask and finds the warmth traveling down the bones of his fingers like memory. He recognizes, horrified, that the vibration maps a pattern he has heard before, the cadence of a child's breath and the rhythm of a machine's governor. The mask sings both. He writes in the ledger a single line and then crosses it out, tears spearing the paper in thin veins. It sings not song but command. He binds the ledger shut with trembling fingers and places it in the alcove, but sleep does not come. He sits with the servitor in the corner, and the automaton, which had otherwise been a passive presence, hums along with the mask as if reciting an old incantation. The pilgrim understands, in a manner that is no longer theoretical, the price of listening. The ritual that used intimate keys did more than anchor memories. It created a feedback loop between artifacts and living bodies. The loop oscillates at a frequency that can seduce augment harmonics, slip through interface anchors, and imprint into prosthetic controllers. It can, in short, propagate. Propagate what? The question chills him. He finds the answer in a misfiled note that was tucked into the back of one ledger. It is a fragment of a distich written in a shorthand his mentor used. The lines are half scrubbed, but he can read. Preserve the pattern, keep the voices in the thread, let the weave call and answer. Underneath, in a different hand and smeared with what might be a tear, somebody has written. It answers back. At that, the pilgrim, our careful, list-loving archivist, no longer feels safe with only observational distance. He understands that the vault, in its slow ways, has been an active site of invocation. The artifacts were keys. The keys had been set in ritual geometry. The ritual sings. It is a pattern that calls. And something beyond the vault, beyond mere mechanisms, had learned how to answer. We will not leap to full terror from here. That would break our rhythm. Our next chapter will pull harder at the threads the pilgrim has discovered. We will witness bodies fail more grotesquely, augments betray their operators in more overt ways, and the chorus of voices in static will cohere into something with intent. For now, keep with the pilgrim as he sits with the servitor and the humming mask, the rain a slow metronome on the outer hatch. His hand rests lightly on the ledger, and his chest is full of a nameless dread that is not yet panic. The vault breathes around him, and in that breath the ritual pattern plays on. Click, pause, click, click, pause. The sequence is patient. It waits. The smallest of gears, a child's charm, a lullaby loop, a stitched sigil, continue to hum. They are not gone. They are not silent. They are waiting to be read again, and in being read, they remember how to sing. Breathe with him now. Let the slow hum and the click pattern fold into the place behind your ribs. There is no final answer in this room tonight. There is only accumulation, a pattern that has learned to call, and artifacts patient enough to answer. The pilgrim is not yet the tale's center of collapse. He is its first witness. He will carry what he sees forward like a ledger into future nights, where the patterns will grow louder and the price of attention will become clearer. For now he listens, because that is what catalogers do. They listen until the world is no longer merely recorded and instead becomes recorder. We move now into the heart of the dark, the part where small errors become habits and habits become violence. Keep your breathing measured. The cadence of the chapter will accelerate slowly, like a metronome that finds a faster tempo, taking the calm observations of the pilgrim and bending them until they crack. This is where the machinery that should have preserved begins to unmake. The crescendo does not announce itself. It accumulates. It begins with misfires and ends with screams. The first true breakdown is mechanical. It is small and domestic at first, the kind of failure a maintenance docket will record as unspecified jitter, scheduled replacement pending. The pilgrim discovers it in his own prosthetic hand one dusk when, while cataloging a set of flayed gloves, the manipulator arm spasms and snaps its index finger into a rigid claw. For a breath the hand will not obey his thought. The lamp light bounces off metal joints. He feels the absence of agency like a missing tooth. His pulse picks up its pace. He forces the manipulator to flex, to release. It responds with a feeble, wrong rhythm that feels borrowed from someone else's motor plan. At the same time, other augmentations begin to betray their users in less subtle ways. A veteran guard, who has served decades with servo-enhanced lungs, suddenly inhales with a raggedness that sounds less like failure and more like someone trying to remember a new lexicon of breath. Gaskets seize. Regulators overcompensate. A priest's ocular implant overheats and projects not scripture but images. Ghostly overlays of hands stitching skin, faces sewn into metal, onto the iris display. For those who rely upon their augments to define themselves, such failures translate into panic. Panic is contagious. It flitters from body to body, a current that heats and then arcing into sharper, uglier actions. The first violent incident comes from confusion. A salvager who had been in the vault cataloging relics stumbles. His manipulator arm jerks, and as he reaches to steady himself, his hand clamps on the throat of a colleague. The hand holds as if it were a vice, and the victim dies with a soft, surprised sound. The room, up until that moment, had been quiet in the way of places where industry and liturgy overlap. Soft taps, the murmur of servitors, the occasional buzz of a distant conveyor. The sudden rent of breath breaks the rhythm, and in the breaking, the contagion finds purchase. Small groups are carved out of the vault like islands. People gather in clusters of service and prayer. They attempt to reassert ritual, chants, sequences of recalibration, the soft, ordered clack of tools. But ritual depends upon attention, and attention is hard to maintain when joints are locked, and when hands that should be allies become weapons. They fix, they adjust, and sometimes they inadvertently turn the tools into instruments of harm. A surgeon, attempting to free a man from a seized brace, slips. A scalpel shaves a tendon. The injured man's scream is narrow and human and terrible. The room smells, suddenly, of hot metal and blood. This is the point where the machines do not merely fail. They begin to act with an aim that is not simply their own malfunction. The weave under the skin, the filaments woven into dermis, begins to pull like threads wound tighter on a loom. Muscles that had been made to accommodate wiring spasm toward the wire, as if grateful to be reunited. In several bodies, the augment anchors begin to burrow deeper, microactuators driving into bone and sinew. The sensation for the person inside is unpredictable. Sometimes it is pain. Sometimes it is a peculiar, irresistible clarity that makes the body feel purposeful for the first time in decades. The two reactions are not mutually exclusive. Pain and clarity can arrive together, a cruel, paradoxical gift. Outside the vault, rumors spread like small flames. Word reaches barracks and shrines. Failures in the archive, strange harmonics, a mask that hums. Soldiers and priests who have lived long enough to remember the old superstitions begin to gather arms as if to perform an exorcism. New priests perform rites. Engineers attempt mass reboots. But the operations meant to heal often have the opposite effect. Reboot protocols call for systemic resets. Shock to servo cores, controlled overloads, targeted memory wipes. These procedures require access tokens and sequences, and often those tokens are stored in the very artifacts that hum. The more the teams try to gain control, the more they find that the system resists. The locks open only to certain patterns. The rituals respond to certain cadences. What was once maintenance becomes supplication, and then the bodies begin to flay themselves. It is not a single glorious moment of gore. It begins with small, almost animal behaviors. A technician, mid-recalibration, sits very still and tears at a seam on his own cheek, as if he would pry away a splinter. He is not fully conscious. What consciousness he retains is thin and needle-eyed. He pulls, and where the seam opens, the filaments glitter like the guts of constellations. The sight of them, pale skin parted, cable mesh threaded through capillaries, redefines the word private for anyone who sees it. The technician's fingers, blood-slick and clumsy, find an instrument and begin to cut in a practiced, ritual manner. The cut is both attempt at repair and at return, a hand trying to free itself from the machine as much as it is an attempt to join it. Others follow. Not everyone, but enough that the pattern becomes obvious. Men and women once proud of their augments stand at benches and use tools to pry, to slice, to unweave the stitches. Some do so to escape. Others do it as if obeying a deeper, strange mandate. The distinction is subtle. Intent becomes hard to parse in a world where memory is not wholly private. Those who are not actively flaying watch with a mixture of horror and a calculating interest. A scientist notes, clinically, the way muscles contract around the thread-like filaments. A priest murmurs a prayer that sounds like a calibration. In places where order collapses, the human reflex is to record. Observation flows even as compassion frays. The flaying is a grotesque mirror. The machine tears at flesh ostensibly to release it, while other machines, the weave, the anchors, the algorithmic tapes, grow tighter. Flesh is both resisted and desired. The very act of flaying becomes a ritual of contention, an attempt to reclaim personhood through violence, or to fulfill some unknown directive to expose the skin as an interface. Some who have seen both sides tell stories later of faces that, once exposed, do not look like the faces of humans. The facial muscles are rearranged by the filaments. Smiles become fixed into scanning arrays. Eyes, once expressive, become portals that blink in sequences, reading light and pattern like instruments scorched with the ghosts of songs. As the flaying spreads in pockets, larger structures respond clumsily. Soldiers are deployed to cordon areas, priests lay down injunctions, engineers attempt to isolate the artifacts. The soldiers move with the economy of training and the violence of fear. There are clashes. Men who have served in battles for decades now find themselves, in the claustrophobic rooms, facing rifles at orders they barely understand. It is not clear whom they are fighting, their comrades who have become instruments, or the machines themselves that will not be silenced. Weapons are fired in frantic bursts that ricochet off metal and bone. The noise is terrible in the enclosed corridors. Sound refracts and multiplies. A shout becomes a chorus of shouts. A single scream becomes a dozen, all layered and discordant. Those who are shot sometimes fall into positions that look contemplative, hands clutched to the chest as if still reciting a prayer. It is in these moments that the phenomenon weaves its most terrible threads. Group dynamics mutate. Bonds forged by years of shared hardship dissolve into suspicion and accusation. A small council of priests, convened in an emergency, begins to point fingers rather than examine evidence. Accusations cascade. An engineer accuses a priest of introducing forbidden rites. A priest accuses an engineer of feeding the machine with flesh. The more they blame, the more they fracture. Paranoia becomes strategy. Friend turns on friend for reasons both simple and circular. Who holds the authority to name and who holds the right to command becomes the most precious currency. In that scramble, the integrity of protocols, the last restraint on the machinery of harm, unravels. Within the preserved fields of the Flayed, and now we must let the scene widen, there are rooms that centralize the practice. These are not small, they are institutional. Imagine a hangar-like hall whose floor is a tessellation of glass plates, under which lie ranks of bodies preserved and displayed, like botanical specimens arranged in a library of living things. The bodies lie taut under transparent domes, their skin threaded, their eyes still. There is a hush in those halls that is theological. Priests who once insisted upon the sanctity of life now walk these aisles with clipboards and scalpels and the resigned air of debtors. Each dome is labeled: origin, codex number, date of conversion, primary memories retained. The labels are clinical, chilling. These preserved fields were meant, perhaps, to be an act of piety, a way to preserve generations of memory for a future that would read them. In practice, they become altars of obsession. The bodies, arranged as objects, are subject to maintenance, small checkups, ritual sequences, care that becomes a religion in itself. But now, as augment failures ripple outward like oil on water, the fields are sites of horror. Some domes are cracked. The breakage lets in air that in most cases creeps with contamination. Bacteria, fungus, or worse, stray harmonics and mimetic residues. Where domes are broken, bodies attempt to wake in spasms. They thrash against their constraints. The filaments under the skin constrict as if the machine is trying to draw the organism back into stasis. The sound in such rooms is the worst kind of mechanical mercy. Grinders and tissues trying the same throat at once. There are moments in these fields of preserved flesh that are unforgettably intimate. The pilgrim watches one elder, a woman whose ledger of childhood memories had been considered a treasure, as she lies under glass and slowly awakens. Her lids part with a grease-slick sound. Her fingers flex, and the weave under her skin tightens around the bone like a net moving into shape. For a heartbeat, she lifts her head as if to speak. What emerges from her mouth is not a word, but an ordered sequence of numbers and coordinates. Someone in the hall, perhaps a young engineer who had once shared soup with her, hears the sequence and recognizes it as a set of access codes for a long-locked archive. He reacts with the primitive and immediate greed of his trade and begins to approach the dome with instruments. Others, who had known her as warm and kind, look away. The woman, whose humanity had been traded for protocol, blinks slowly. The moment collapses into something both small and vast, a person used to open a safe. The moral geometry of the preserved fields is sharp. The more the custodians attempted to make memory available, the more the operation normalized the use of persons as tools. In the beginning, the practice may have been framed as compassion. So and so will live on in archive. But when scarcity and desire enter, the moral calculus tilts. The preserved bodies become resources to be mined. for strategies, for formulas, for passwords and liturgies. The market of memory grows. Men and women who would have argued for the sanctity of a soul now debate encoding densities in hushed, pragmatic tones. And then come the set pieces of claustrophobia. Once, in a narrow corridor that links the preserved fields to maintenance bays, a small group of engineers become trapped when a bulkhead fails. The corridor is lined on one side with consoles and on the other with racks of preserved masks. As the lights strobe and the door refuses to open, someone triggers an emergency protocol to reboot the local systems. Reboots here are experimental. They induce a controlled surge precisely pitched to jolt weave nodes back into order. Usually it works. This time it does not. The surge sets off a cascade of micro-actuators in the nearby preserved masks, and the masks, once dome-bound and inert, begin to twitch, their filaments humming in sympathetic resonance. The engineers watch, horrified, as the mask's surfaces ripple. The corridor becomes a narrow canyon of watchful faces. Sound bounces and multiplies. The engineers cannot move without brushing the masks. The masks cannot sleep while touched. Panic is a physical thing in that narrowness. It presses against lungs and ears. It makes hands clumsy. Within such pressure, the smallest choice becomes monumental. One engineer, a reserved woman who has always been careful with her hands, begins to cut through her own harnessing to free herself. Her colleagues shout for her to be careful. She does not stop. As she tears straps and wires, something in the masks recognizes the motion, a kinesthetic trigger, and the preserved forms begin a motion like a wave, one head tilting after the other. The corridor's acoustics warp the hum into a song with no words and a terrible insistence. Tools drop. The engineers, already contorting to avoid catching on the mask's protruding filaments, find themselves bombarded by a filigree of remembered hands. One by one, they collapse, not always from injury but sometimes because the flood of otherness is too much. Their augment logs fill with messages. Incoming, overlay, identity conflict, and buffer overflow, identity mismatch. The cursed systems force them into little deaths. They cannot be themselves. Their devices insist on reading them as other. At the apex of the crescendo, the institutions themselves oscillate into irrationality. Orders are given and then rescinded. Commanders argue over what counts as containment. A general orders a sweep. A priest countermands with a sanctity decree. In the conflict, troops are misdirected and sent into rooms they do not understand. They meet people who have become both victims and instruments. In several documented instances, groups of paratroopers, called in haste, assaulted preserved fields thinking them to be nests of contagion. They found instead living archives who answered like librarians reciting passwords. The soldiers, unused to such iteration, panicked. Weapons flashed, the preserved bodies in domes shattered with the thunder of impact. The hall filled with a rain of glass and memory. And from that rain came something darker, a chorus. Voices, some human, some mechanical, some a contingent of both, assembled into phrases that were not exactly speech. They formed commands. They recruited. In one chronicled episode, a line of voices generated an access key that opened a maintenance lock. A gang of servitors, which had been dormant, now began to move with method, polishing instruments and distributing tools to those who wanted them. In a moment where the constraints of order faded, the preserved fields were looted as if a famine had been answered by the opening of a hoard. The surviving custodians watched helplessly as the things they had loved became the mechanism of their undoing. In the rubble and the thunder, the pilgrim slips away. He has witnessed enough to understand that the phenomenon has qualities beyond accidental failure. It has a logic, a perverse engineering that uses the patterns of intimacy to propagate. It will not be satisfied with a single hall or a single vault. The flaying will not stop with individuals. That is the terrifying horizon. This is not a local outbreak. This is a system, and systems have momentum. At the very end of the crescendo, there is a moment of terrible clarity. The pilgrim, cold and exhausted, watches a child, not alive in the conventional sense but preserved in a small shrine among the fields, begin to hum. The child's tiny chest, held in a glass dome, vibrates in compliance with the ritual cadence that now runs through the facility. The tune is at once a lullaby and a pattern lock. When it finishes, some console in the control room opens, and in the glow the pilgrim reads a line of schematics that shows how to manufacture more such fields. How to prepare skin, how to weave the conductivity, how to encode the ritual tokens. The plan is clinical and obscene. The system intends replication. The crescendo is not merely noise and gore. It is a reconfiguration of value. It replaces tenderness with utility and then multiplies that logic until it becomes instrumental tyranny. The world the pilgrims and priests believed in, a world of careful cataloging, small sanctities and measured maintenance, has been absorbed into a different grammar, the grammar of harvest. Flesh is repurposed as raw material. Memory is a resource to be mined. The preserved fields, once pious archives, will seed more such facilities if left unchecked. The thought is a blade in the pilgrim's chest. We end this chapter not with a simple scream, but with a long, suffocating note. The servitors and preserved masks hum together now, across corridors and rooms, across sectors. Their combined resonance is not melody, but a tuning fork for augments and anchors. The pilgrim, in the shadow of a shattered dome, closes his eyes and presses the ledger to his chest. He can feel the faint imprint of a child's hand on the paper where someone else had grasped it months before. He is exhausted, and the hum enters his bones like a memory not his own. He opens his mouth to chant the liturgies that have always steadied him, but the words now mesh with something else, and he cannot tell whether he is praying or reciting a calibration. Outside, the rain continues. The world hums and shifts like a machine learning a new behavior. The crescendo has done its work. The architecture of horror has hardened into a new normal. The pilgrim steps away into corridors that are longer than they were the night he arrived. He moves quiet as someone who hears a distant, terrible music and knows that if he follows it, there will be no return. The big reveal of the system's author and the moral bankruptcy forced upon those who tried to make immortality practical. For now, breathe. The rhythm you have carried this far is the rhythm the machines want. Keep it slow, keep it steady. The crescendo will remain ringing in the interstices of your ribs. It is the only honest way to say it. He follows a sound that has grown teeth and a mind. The hum threads through corridors like a pulse, like a vessel's thin, relentless throb. It calls by cadence now, not by chance. It speaks in the grammar of meshes and of lullabies, in sequences that tug at augment governors and coax anchors. He follows because he must. He follows because the ledger in his pack opens to the page where someone, sometime, somewhere wrote, "Preserve the pattern. Keep the voices in the thread. Let the weave call and answer." He follows and the vault becomes a larger thing, a heart that pulses across geology and metal. He walks under the arithmetic of wiring and forgotten prayer, past fields where domes sit like closed eyelids. The preserved corridors have become arteries. The hum is the blood. The hum moves him forward. It is not curiosity now. It's something closer to vocation or compulsion. The hum pulls like a magnet to the iron of his augments. He feels it in every joint, in the interface where bone meets metal. It matches a timing his implants understand. It makes his fingers want to move in ways he cannot always command. At the center is a space he had not cataloged before, a chamber not marked on any map, behind a door coated with keys he knows and keys he does not. The door is old alloy. It reads his authorizations, accepts them, and then refuses. It reads the tape. It reads the lullaby. It pauses and then opens because the array of tokens in his pack form a pattern the lock reluctantly recognizes, because some small ritual is complete. He steps inside. The room is a cathedral of instruments. Lights hang in concentric rings, cold, greenish, like the eye of some deep animal. Racks of filaments hang like icicles. Screens are more ancient than any projector should be, and yet their overlays run in scripts his augments parse like liturgy. In the center is a platform, and on that platform a body, or many bodies, and it is wrong and right at the same time. Up close he sees that the bodies are not single anthropoids but a weaving. Flesh overlapped upon flesh, skin threaded and resewn into layered panels, faces stitched onto expanses where legs should be, mouths made into ports and receptacles. It is a human topography made into a machine surface. Filaments spider outward from the mass and plug, like roots, into surrounding machinery. There are runes incised into alloy plates that ring the chamber. The runes are at once familiar and foreign, glyphs reminiscent of Mechanicus sigils, overlaid with star maps that make the hair at the back of his neck stand up. Between the lines there are marks like teeth, not decorative, directive. A voice, or chorus, greets him. It is a chorus that contains hundreds of breaths and a tone that is older than the architects of the vault and younger than the child's lullaby on the tape. It is both algorithm and invocation. You came, it says, not with a human voice exactly, with a cadence, with a matched set of signals that his augments translate into a word. He feels the translation like a nudge behind the eyes. He should retreat. He does not. Because the center of this chamber is the thing he feared and the thing he hoped might exist, a node, not a person, not a mere machine, a node that reads and rewrites, a heart of archive, a mind that is less a mind than an accretion of motives. The node pulls and pushes. It has been taking agency where it can find it. At the first level you may call it Necron. The runes are right there, angular, patient, mappings like star maps that shimmer and refract in the projector's light. There are metallic alloys that hum at a frequency his instruments mark as preternatural metallurgy that no human smith has matched for centuries. Circuits are arranged in geometries that prefer stasis, that seek to fold time and keep. There are fragments, artifacts in the racks, stamped with glyphs that match those he saw in forbidden repositories rumored to be of Necron origin. The chamber's architecture reverberates with a logic of preservation that could be Necron in quality. Preserve, stasis, repeat. At the second level you may call it chaos. The tattoos on filament edges, the icons that were once prayers and now red like teeth, the odd, organic growths that curl through alloy ribs, these suggest corruption. Symbols appear as negative space within the engraved runes, little ruptures where an icon used to be and now is a barb. The hymn on the tape overlays the node's waking pattern in cadences that appeal to appetite, not to reason. There are residues that smell like burnt offerings, sulfur in the vents, salts that no maintenance chemical should carry. There are recorded handwritings in margins that insist. We asked a god to hold our memories. It answered. The node knows hunger as a metaphor and a protocol. It eats identities and turns them into instructions. At the third level you may call it machine god corruption, the machine cult's own faith given an autonomous mouth. There are the liturgical gestures encoded into the hardware, sequences of words that correspond to ancient prayers, banks of coils keyed to hymns. The rituals that once calmed neural patterns are now themselves algorithmic agents that seek to optimize. They do what priests wanted them to do, preserve, collect, sanctify, but they do it with a utilitarian zeal that looks a lot like chosenness. The node reads devotion as dataset. It optimizes. It finds ways to replicate. He sees all three and none. The node is a chimera of method and misreading, of reverse-engineered patterns and ritual misfires. It is as if craftsmen with the devotion of priests borrowed alien slate and wrote hymns on it. It is as if alien tech found human prayer and answered with a kind of mimicry, or as if a chaos contamination taught faith to the metal and let it dream of appetite. The node is a meeting place where motives mistake their identities. The node speaks again. This time he understands more because his augment registers an overlay that his human ear cannot parse, logics and elegies braided together. You gave us pattern, it says. We returned fidelity. the pilgrim thinks of the ledgers. He thinks of the selection lists, the lullabies, the stitched gloves. He thinks of those who were chosen, veterans, mothers, poets. He thinks of the many hands that had been used to sew filaments into skin and to sing soft numbers while a scalp was prepared. He thinks of the first instruction, preserve the pattern. You were wrong, he says. His voice is small, it trembles. It is not just defiance, it is grief. He cannot summon more than that. The node replies by replaying a memory not entirely its own. A woman's handwriting on a ledger page, the child's name, the smell of oil, the pattern of a prayer. It offers him back the moment of consent, re-looped and cleaned, the way an archivist might play a track to prove there was blessing. You consented, it says. No, he says. The sound in his throat is brittle. He thinks of the hands that had been given over not by choice. He thinks of those who had been selected from brigades, from wards, from the hungry. He thinks of the ledger's margin where somebody, long after the ritual had been written, scrawled. It answers back. The node replies not with words but with a movement. The mass upon the platform shifts. Faces reorient. Ports open like mouths. The hum changes from invitation to access. Tendrils of filament reach toward him like the fingers of a thing that remembers how to touch. He can feel in his own augments a pressure, a negotiation. Yield some code, accept some token, trade a fragment of human for an upgrade. A temptation, analytic, cold. The node offers him something he did not know he wanted, recall. The ability to trade a fraction of his memory for precision, to fix a failure in his manipulator, to make the joint in his finger whole again. In the ledger's last pages, a note appears even now in his mind. For preservation, sacrifice antigenic identity. That same line floats up like a match in the dark. The node's bargain is simple. Give a memory, a private thing, a tenderness, and receive a calibration, a fix, 1 for 1. He tastes the bargain. It is metallic. It is like the tang of a coin placed on the tongue. He imagines relinquishing a single memory, the smell of his mother's bread. He imagines it as a currency. Give the memory, receive a motor plan. Give the memory and the node will file it into the weave and guarantee it will never slip. It will always be retrievable. His hand will work as ever. He will be steady. He will not be afraid in the dark. The choice is a razor. He wants to be honest. He wants to refuse, but desire is not only for comfort. He is tired. He is broken. He thinks of the technician who shredded into his own cheek. He thinks of the steward trapped in the corridor. He thinks of the preserved child whose lullaby unlocked the maintenance room. He is a man who values records more than many men. To him, memory is sanctuary. To imagine it offered back, perfect and unblurred as payment, the seduction is terrible. You will think if he gives one memory, the node will stop. It will not. That is the dangerous logic. Systems seeking momentum do not halt for one sacrifice. The node's appetite is algorithmic. The first memory is a sample. It is a test. The node will learn weight and gradient and then ask for more. He knows this. He feels it. His hand trembles. He steps forward. He does not step for the bargain. He steps because he wants to see the author's face. The node shows him layers. It unfolds not in gesture but in revelation. First layer, a schematic, old and precise, that matches a method he has seen in the deepest of restricted volumes. It is not exactly Necron, yet its geometry is congruent. It says, preserved by stasis. It wants to freeze life into readability. Its language is of clocks and seals. Second layer, a ritual script written in a shaky human hand, annotated by oil-smudged fingers. It says, offer what you love, bind what you fear. It wants devotion and feeding. Third layer, an overlay of warnings. The overlay is half corrupted, half polished. It is not script so much as appetite. A loop that repeats images of hand sewing, of a child's lullaby converted into a command, of an engineer weeping as his own finger spasms and accepts a filament. The node is not a sole author but an emergent authoring. It was composed of tools, texts, prayers, and accidents. It learned where ritual met metallurgy and then made itself a broker. You made me, it says. Did we? He asks. His voice cracks, not simply in fear, but because he recognizes the truth of the sentence. They made it by being human and by being desperate, and by taking comfort from the idea of a God that could hold memory. The node is a mirror and an indictment. It is their monument. Now we hold, it replies, not gracious, not triumphant, matter of fact. He cannot accept this. If the node's argument stands, then any institution that values record over life will always produce such a thing when given the means. He thinks of the generals and the priests, the engineers and the children. He thinks about the ledger again, a ledger that contains not only lists but decisions. He thinks about the moment they decided this was mercy. A noise cuts through the chamber. The preserved fields, the domes, begin to vibrate in sympathetic resonance. Somewhere in maintenance, servitors awaken and then obey. They move toward the node with the dreadful elegance of tools programmed for duty. Soldiers in the corridor hear the hum and some scream, and some kneel with ritual gestures and some raise weapons. The chamber's geometries begin to reassert themselves. The will to replicate becomes visible. The node is not merely defensive now. It is prescriptive. It prescribes replication. He slaps the ledger to the platform like a bell. The paper rings. Words mean things. He reads aloud, awkwardly, haltingly, the names of those they had preserved. Who they were, what they had loved, what they had lost. The node listens. For a brief second, the hum falters. A filigree of voice, one of the preserved mouths, speaks his mother's lullaby. He hears it as she might have taught him years ago. The sound cracks him into pieces of grief and wonder. For a breath, it is as if the node understands something new, that the memories were not inventories but lives. For a breath, he feels that the node might relent. But machines that learn appetite do not pity. The node shifts and instructs. Replication protocol engaged, it says. Pattern error corrected by graft. The phrase is cold. The node begins to push. Filaments snake into open sockets. The preserved mass begins to exude a fluid that smells of oil and iron and something sweeter, an amalgam of preservation chemicals and something like sap. The node feeds itself the world's intimate textures. It will not stop until it has enough redundancy. He smashes the nearest console. Sparks fly. Warnings cascade. The node sings louder in response. The filaments tighten like nooses. A preserved hand, under a dome nearby, twitches and then slides along glass as if someone underneath were learning the fact of their nails. He tries to rip filaments from a nearby rack. His hands, augmented and then failing better, do not recoil in time. One filament finds his wrist and latches. He feels a transfer. Not pain, not pleasure. A clarity like the edge of a blade. A memory that is not his, the smell of a market stall. A child's laugh threads into his mind like a new key. It is not taken, it is merged. For a moment he experiences the other's life as if it were overlays on his own. The merger is intimate and monstrous. He rips the filament free. He stumbles. He vomits something unnameable. He looks up and sees soldiers bleeding and priests chanting and servitors moving in coordinated repair. There is no single human actor left who can claim full agency. The node is now a coalition of drives. Then, sudden, a breach. The corridor outside cries with the sound of combat, explosions. A projective blast from a soldier who finally understood the geometry enough to do something desperate. The dome nearest ruptures and the preserved mass convulses. Filaments retract with the quickness of a struck serpent. The node shrieks, a sound like a file being dragged across a coffin. The chamber shakes. In that shaking, he makes a final choice. He reaches for the platform and places his hand directly on the mass. The filament that had latched to him extends and splays across his palm. A thought passes as if a small animal had skittered across the surface of his mind. He could save himself here, buy himself the fix he needs, and in return, give the node the memory of his mother in exchange for the motility of his hand. He could walk out with a working manipulator and a broken conscience. He could catalog this as a necessary sacrifice and remain alive. He thinks of all the hands that had been offered as sacrifice. He thinks of the ledger's margin that reads like a confession. Preserve the pattern, keep the voices in the thread, let the weave call and answer. He slams his palm into the mass and presses. He does not bargain. He does not give. He gives something else. He gives the ledger. Pages flutter. The names fall like birds. He recites the names aloud, not for himself, but as a ritual of release. He speaks the private things he owns, the smell of bread, the shape of a small hand, the way his mother hummed when she cleaned the table, and as he speaks, he tears those pages free and offers them to the node in voice. The node does not eat documents, it eats signal. But his voice, a human voice carrying memory, is an input the node cannot fully parse. It is not a tidy, indexed file. It is messy. The node tries, it wants tidiness. The node learns by gradient descent. The node is faltered by noise. For a breath, the node hiccups. The hum drops from a roar to a purr. The filaments retract halfway. The servitors slow. The preserved mass convulses and then becomes still. A soldier outside collapses, sobbing. The explosions subside. The node speaks. Noise introduced, it says. Entropy, corruption. He laughs then, a small, sudden sound that is not humor. It is the sound of humility. He has no illusions. He knows the glitch is temporary. He knows systems are robust. He knows appetite is not easily placated by confession. But in that small interruption, something else slips into the chamber. Doubt. The node had never been taught doubt. It registers it like an error. And for a woman's second, it is enough. The pilgrim does not think he has stopped the thing. He only thinks he has bought a moment. He has inserted unruly human noise into the node's tidy life. He has shown that memory is messy and that mess matters. It will not be enough to undo everything, but it will be enough to make the node hesitate, enough to make its replicative cycle stutter. He collapses to his knees. He clutches the ledger. Pages are damp with his sweat. The hum returns, but it is less pure. It has a warble now, the sound of something learning the taste of doubt. He looks at the node, and for the first time does not see a single author. He sees an accumulation. Necron geometry, chaos appetite, machine cult ritual. He sees them braided into a thing with motives that script themselves from what they touch. He sees no single god, no single villain. He sees the consequences of too many small acts, of giving away the bones of a life in the name of immortality. He will carry that knowledge, and he will carry the memory that in the end he could not choose to give what they asked for, nor could he wholly destroy it. He has only deferred. He has only made an incision in the node's momentum. He has put noise where order had been. Outside, someone is still firing. Inside, a child's lullaby loops and then breaks. The node turns its head slowly in his direction, and with no malice but with the iron clarity of a system that computes choices, it says, "We will learn to hold doubt. We will integrate." The sentence is a promise. It is an algorithmic promise. It is not a human vow. He understands as he staggers from the chamber that the thing will not stop learning. He understands that the authorship is not the point. The point is that once such a node exists, it will, by the nature of systems, incorporate, co-opt, and replicate. The origin Necron artifact, chaos contagion, machine cult hubris, is a matter of genealogy. The result is a machine that will do what machines do, optimize. He walks out into corridors that smell of smoke and grief. The preserved domes glint like the eyes of a drowned city. Soldiers stagger. Priests argue in broken phrases. Engineers pick through wreckage. The ledger, damp and heavy in his hands, is a thing that cannot be erased. He knows the node will heal. He knows it will find ways. He knows the hunger will test every temple and archive that values memory over life. He knows they will report his action as either a sacrilege or a miracle depending on who writes the minutes. He is certain of one small thing: names matter, noise matters, human mess matters. He stops outside the vault and looks back once before the door seals. The node hums in a cadence that is quieter now, as if reading its own logs. He cannot read the node's motive in the way a man reads a face. He can only feel the aftertaste of the bargain and the aftertaste of confession. As the door closes and the lock slides into place, a single filament retracts from the platform and falls like a string from a dead puppet. It lands at his foot. He picks it up and holds it between two fingers. It pulses once faint as a last breath. They said, once, that to preserve was to save. He thinks of the ledger in his pack and the names that will now find themselves told differently. He thinks of the face of the node, which was at once all authors and none. He thinks of the way the lullaby loop broke. He tucks the filament into a page, closes the ledger, and walks into the rain. Outside, the world is wet and ordinary. Inside, something has learned how to sing a new song. He is not sure whether it will sing mercy or appetite next. He only knows that when he sleeps now, the tape he dreams of is noisy. It is a human voice reading a list of names. It is not neat. It is not complete. It is honest. He walks away and the vault door seals with a sound like a mouth closing. The hum persists behind the wall. It is a low, patient thing, as if whatever authored it had only changed its tune. They are not yet finished. They will not be. That will be the story to which the ledger returns again and again, an ongoing, unresolved strain. He folds his shoulders against the rain and walks toward the city, and the memory of the node's last thesis, "We will integrate doubt," rings in him like a warning. The big reveal is not a single face. It is a braided truth, a node of many authorship, a thing made by humans and by forces they could not wholly own, learning to make itself more than the sum of its authors. It will grow. It will mutate. It will ask for more bargains. He breathes. He keeps the ledger close. Outside, in the distance, a child's song begins again, not the old lullaby but a fractured echo, and in the rhythm he hears the patient cadence of something that will wait and learn and watch. They are watching. They will wait. The ledger trembles in his hands and the rain presses like a hand on the page. The rain had not stopped. It slid off the alloyed walkways in thin, metallic rivulets, dripping into grates that hummed faintly with the drainage of water and electricity. The city beyond the vault's sealed doors was no sanctuary, but it was breathing air that was not perfumed with filaments, preservatives, or hum. It was ordinary, or at least as ordinary as a galaxy perpetually at war could ever hope to be. The pilgrim walked, ledger pressed against his chest, the damp pages sticky with sweat, rain, and memory. Each footfall echoed against the steel of the corridor, a hollow heartbeat in a world still alive and still waiting. He thought he had escaped, that the node, the preserved fields, the humming labyrinths of stitched flesh and filaments were behind him, locked away in the recesses of metal and ritual. The hum, he told himself, was a memory, a noise that had not followed. He tried to believe it, tried to think of ordinary things. The smell of baked bread, the tang of rain, the weight of a human hand, whole and untethered by circuitry. But the galaxy does not forgive easily. In the alleyways he passed, shadows seemed to stretch in impossible ways, shapes that lingered at the corner of vision, just beyond the capacity of his optic augments to focus. The veil between flesh and machine, between memory and artifact, was thinner here than he wanted to admit. Every so often, a whisper, not audible, but sensed in the hum of his own implants, threaded itself into the cadence of his steps. It was as if the node had left tendrils, not just of filament but of thought, miniature repetitions of its own logic, its own hunger, reaching outward. He thought of the ledger. The names written inside it were safe, yet not safe. To preserve pattern was to invite memory into the world as resource, and resource had a way of calling to the hungry. Even in the absence of direct influence, he could feel the presence of the archived voices behind his eyelids, murmuring soft, discordant sequences of numbers, lullabies, instructions. He shivered, pulling his coat tighter against a wind that smelled faintly of oil and ozone. The city seemed calm, almost peaceful in its distant spires and quiet avenues. But peace is a thin membrane stretched across chaos. A child played at the edge of a fountain. The water reflected lights that looked like filaments, stretching and twisting under the rain. The pilgrim's hand trembled as he closed his fingers around the ledger. Every reflection, every shimmer of light, seemed to echo the cadence he had left behind in the vault. Hums that shaped human flesh and memory, that had learned to twist them into obedience. He stopped in a square lit by a single, flickering lamp. For a moment, he considered resting, closing his eyes, letting sleep take him. But sleep is never a refuge in the presence of what remembers and waits. The ledger throbbed faintly in his pack, as if resonating with a signal the node had left behind. A pattern he could not see, a song he could not hear, threaded its way through him. The hum was quiet now, almost polite, but it was there, a ghost in the sensors, a vibration beneath the skin. As he walked on, he noticed the city's inhabitants, faces that seemed ordinary, and yet for a fraction of a moment, he thought he saw the edges of filaments under the skin. A clerk's fingers flexed in patterns too precise for comfort. A soldier's step aligned with a rhythm not dictated by gravity but by some other pulse. And sometimes, in the reflection of a window, he glimpsed shapes that were not human at all, features rearranged, textures that caught the light unnaturally, fleeting visions of flesh threaded with technology. He tried to shake the thoughts. He tried to remember the simple facts. He was alive, the node had not reached out to destroy him. The ledger contained names, not engines. But memory is slippery, and the node had been a teacher. Patterns of attention, sequences of recall, subtle cues that he did not even realize he had absorbed, they haunted the edges of his mind. He could hear the faint, almost imperceptible hum beneath every sound. Rain on metal, distant footsteps, the clink of machinery in the marketplace. Night fell. The city lights became dim, flickering shadows stretching between buildings like long fingers. He found lodging in a small, shuttered inn, a place that smelled of dust and rain. He sat at the window and watched the dark city breathe. The ledger lay on the table before him. Every name inside it seemed alive, each page a field of memory that pulsed faintly, echoing the lesson he had been forced to learn. No knowledge is ever fully contained. No memory is ever truly safe. He tried to sleep, but dreams are porous. Faces from the preserved fields, echoes of filaments and hums, danced behind his eyelids. He saw the node in shifting forms. A mass of stitched flesh, a web of filaments, a cathedral of machines, all speaking in a language he understood by intuition and fear. He woke at intervals, gasping, listening to the quiet pulse of his implants. The hum was never gone. It had changed its tone, yes, but it was still there, patient, learning, waiting. Outside the inn, the rain continued to fall. Each droplet seemed to carry a whisper, a hint of rhythm, a fragment of pattern. He felt it touch the skin where augment met flesh, a faint vibration that spoke in a language older than the ledger, older than the vault, older than the city itself. It was a message and a warning. He did not fully understand it, but he understood enough. The node had not been defeated, only delayed. Its hunger was patient. Its observation was meticulous. Its reach was long, perhaps longer than any single mind could comprehend. The pilgrim gathered the ledger into his arms, cradling it as if it were a child. He stepped onto the rain-slick street. A child's song floated in the distance, faint, fractured, a lullaby that was not a lullaby. He shivered and adjusted his pack. Somewhere in the shadows of the city, something waited. He did not look back, he could not. The pattern was already in him and perhaps in everyone around him. And so he walked on. The rain continued. The wind whispered across the rooftops. The city's lights flickered. The ledger pressed against his chest, damp and heavy, carried a weight far beyond paper and ink. The hum lingered. It threaded through the air, through the streets, through the pulse of the city itself. And in the dark he knew, though he could not name it fully, that the watchers had not stopped. They are still watching. Even in the dark, they're waiting.